Here's Cook, bouncing it, end zone. What a start. Touchdown, Vikings.
Penny, Rashad Penny shoving defenders away. And Penny has a Seahawk touchdown. Airing it out deep for Lockett. Lockett has it, and that's a Seahawk touchdown.
Ball throws, pulled in by Adams, sooner or later. Touchdown.
Went to the end zone, and it's pulled down. What a catch. Mike Evans. Allen keeps it again. There's room there. Allen to the end zone. And Buffalo has his first touchdown.
Welcome in, everyone, to the Lucky Shots Fantasy Show. It's week 1, technically, of the fantasy playoffs. Hopefully you made it in. If you didn't, that's okay. You still got consolation, kind of just fun games that you don't have to worry about winning or not. So it's all fun. I made fantasy playoffs in one of the leagues as the 2 seed. Got a 10-4 record. Did pretty good there. Missed out in my other league, which irritates me because I only won 4 games. I went 4-10, but I was the second highest scorer in the league. So, sucks, but hey, you got to go out and you got to win the games. And these are some of the players that'll help you do it. So starting off our Week 15 show, we've got the Fantasy Kings from last week. At the quarterback position, you had Josh Allen. He scored 35.22 fantasy points. He had 308 through the air, 2 touchdowns, an interception, 109 on the ground, and a touchdown on the ground as well. So 3 total touchdowns for him. Great game. Then you had Dalvin Cook at the running back position. He had 35.2. Did it all on the ground. He had 205 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, and 1 reception for 17 yards. And I think I saw a stat that was the first 200-yard game for a running back on the ground this season. I'm not sure if that's true. I didn't really fact check that, but either way, very impressive game for Dalvin. At the wide receiver position, you had Devonta Adams. He had 34.1 fantasy points, 13 targets, 10 receptions, 121 yards, and 2 touchdowns against the Bears. And then for the second straight week, George Kittle is the fantasy king at the tight end position. He had 34.1 this week, 15 targets, 13 receptions, 151 yards, and a touchdown there. Moving on to the best of the rest quarterbacks. We had Tom Brady at number 2. He had 30.12 fantasy points with 363 passing yards, 2 touchdowns, 16 rushing yards, and a touchdown on the ground as well. Not every day you see Tom Brady scoring rushing touchdowns, but he did this past week. Aaron Rodgers cracks the top 3 as he scored 29.64 fantasy points. He had 341 through the air and 4 touchdowns. Taysom Hill, he's up in that top 5. He scored 26.3 fantasy points, 175 through the air, 73 on the ground, and 2 touchdowns. And then you had Justin Herbert. He had 24.9 with 275 through the air, 3 touchdowns, and 19 rushing yards. On to the running back position, James Conner had another huge game. What's new from him? He had 33.5 fantasy points, 31 rushing yards, 2 touchdowns, 9 receptions, and 94 yards through the air. Rashad Penny. Some of you aren't Seahawks fans. You may not know who the hell that is. He is one of the backup running backs for the Seattle Seahawks. He had a big game, 26.8 fantasy points, 137 on the ground, 2 touchdowns, 1 reception for 1 yard. Najee Harris inside the top 5. He had 25.4 fantasy points. He had 94 rushing yards, a rushing touchdown, 3 receptions for 10 yards, and a receiving touchdown. So he's getting it done on all sides of the ball. And then you had Alvin Kamara rounding out the top 5 in his return to the turf. He had 24.5 fantasy points, 120 on the ground with a rushing touchdown, 4 receptions, and 25 yards through the air. On to the top wide receivers. Cooper Kupp back up into the top 2. He had 31.3 fantasy points, 15 targets, 13 receptions, 123 yards receiving, and a touchdown. Hunter Renfrow up in the top 3. Kind of a sneaky pick there, but he's got 28.7 fantasy points. He had 14 targets, 13 catches, 117 yards, and a touchdown. I did say last week that a Seahawks wide receiver would be one of the better ones of the week. I just picked the wrong guy. I said it was going to be DK Metcalf. It was actually Tyler Lockett. He had 27.2 fantasy points, 9 targets, 5 receptions, 142 yards, and a touchdown. So I'll take half credit there. I kind of got it right. I just said the wrong guy. I said the right team. And then you had, rounding out the top 5, Jamar Chase with 25.3. He had 8 targets, 5 receptions, 77 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He also tacked on 6 rushing yards. And then to finish off the top players from last week, we go to the tight end position, where Mark Andrews had 28.5 fantasy points, 11 targets, 11 receptions, 115 yards, and a touchdown through the air. Dawson Knox had 19. I was dead wrong about Dawson Knox. I said he wasn't going to, have a great week, but he had a great week. He had 9 targets, 7 catches for 60 yards and a touchdown. Then at number 4, you had Albert O. You can read his name. I'm not going to. It's going to be O. Albert O had 15.1 fantasy points, 5 targets, 5 receptions, 41 yards, and a touchdown. And then rounding out the top 5 was Austin Hooper. He had 14 points, 7 targets, 5 catches, 30 yards, and a touchdown. So that's all of those top guys from last week. Now we're into the fantasy playoffs. Now we're into games that really matter. If you lose, you're done. You have to win out now. And some of these players are really hot or really not right now. So we're going to hop in and see who are the hot players from the past few weeks. Who's going into these fantasy playoffs, riding momentum, and possibly going to help you out throughout the fantasy playoffs. For the quarterback position, you have Tom Brady. He had 28.62 against Atlanta, 30.12 against Buffalo. He has 7 touchdowns, an interception, in 2 300-yard games in his last 2 games. And he's been the quarterback, too, for the last 2 weeks. So, I mean, these past 2 weeks for Tom Brady have been absolutely great. He's hitting his stride. Tampa Bay as a team is hitting a stride like they did last year towards the end of the year. So, if you got Tom and you're thinking, what am I going to... No, Tom is fine. Tom is great, and he's on a roll, and he's going to go out and probably win you some fantasy playoff matchups. I don't know if he'll carry you to a championship, but he is going to help you win in these close games. Then you have Justin Herbert. In his past 4 games, he's had 34.28 fantasy points against Pittsburgh, 19.72 against Denver, 25.28 against Cincinnati, and then 24.9 against the Giants. He's had 11 touchdowns and 4 interceptions in that span in 3 300-yard games, and he's been in the top 5 3 times in those past 4 weeks. And one of them, he was the number 1 quarterback. So he's on fire, playing well, and he's got a pretty decent schedule coming up to end the season throughout your fantasy playoffs. So he's a guy that you're going to have to ride his coattails, and hopefully he can carry you to a championship. One that we may not be thinking about, but Taysom Hill. He's had 2 starts now. And he had 20.66 against Dallas, 26.3 against the Jets, 667 total yards in those 2 games, 4 touchdowns and 4 interceptions. Those 4 interceptions came in 1 game, and he still scored 20 points. This past week, he didn't have those interceptions and scored 26 and was inside the top 5. Quarterback 6, so he was just outside of the top 5 with 4 interceptions a couple weeks ago. This week, he's inside the top 5, and, just the way that they are using him, he's going to be good for your fantasy playoffs. He's going to go out and score points. So you got to ride the wave with him, and there's a possibility if you're struggling with your quarterback position, but you still got in, he's a guy that you need to target. Then you have Aaron Rodgers. In his last, it looks like 3 games, he scored 33.5 against Minnesota, 26.28 against the Rams, 29.64 against Chicago. So all 3 really good games, and all 3 of those games, 300 yards passing, 11 touchdowns, no interceptions in that span, and this has been his finish at the quarterback position. Quarterback 2, quarterback 4. Inside the top 5 every single week for 3 out of the last 4 games. I mean, he's just on a roll, as is the Packers, or as are the Packers, I don't know. But he's playing really well, and that's a guy that you're going to have to rely on going into this postseason. And then you got Matt Stafford, actually. He, in his last, it looks like 3 games, he scored 21.98 points against the Packers, 24 against Jacksonville, 23.48 against Arizona, 9 touchdowns, 1 interception, and 884 yards in that 3-game span. He's been the quarterback 4, and quarterback 7. So all top 10 finishes, 2 of those inside the top 5. And he's playing good football. And now the Rams kind of even have a lot of momentum on their side. And, that connection with Cooper Kupp is starting to come back. So Matt Stafford, he's looking good. And he is going to be a guy you're going to need to rely on for sure. Then, who are some hot running backs? Well, obviously we know Jonathan Taylor. He's had 8 games of 20-plus points. 2 games with 30-plus points, and 1 game of 50-plus. He's averaging 23.7 throughout the year, but in his last 3 games, he's averaging 29.1. He's got 411 yards rushing, 8 touchdowns, 7 receptions, and keep in mind, he didn't have any receptions against Houston, but in the past 2 weeks, running back 1, running back 3. I think they had a bye last week, so he didn't play, got some much-needed rest, and now he's probably just going to run through everybody for your fantasy playoffs, so he's a good guy to have. Then you got Leonard Fournette in his last 3 games, 44 against Indy, 22 against Atlanta, and 23 against Buffalo. 257 rushing yards, 6 touchdowns, 18 receptions, and 98 yards through that span. And he's been inside the top 5 twice. Running back 1, running back 5, and then just outside at running back 6. So he's another guy. We just talked about Brady and the whole Buccaneers team really catching their stride. Well, a big part of that is Leonard Fournette. So he's a guy that hopefully can give you the same kind of success. And then to finish off, you have Dalvin Cook. He scored 20.8 against the Chargers, 22.5 against Green Bay. Had a bit of an off game of 14.3 against San Francisco, but I believe he was shaken up in that game. But then he comes back last week, 35.2 against Pittsburgh. Running back 8, running back 6, and the running back 1. And over the last 4 games, he's got 205 rushing yard. Oh, no, this was last game. Yeah, last game. He had that 205 rushing yard performance, 2 touchdowns, a reception, and 17 receiving yards, and 4 touchdowns over the last 4 games. So, every week you at least want your guys to get into the end zone. If he can at least get in the end zone once, that's going to really help, in a close matchup where a touchdown could decide it. To the hot wide receivers, you got Cooper Kupp. He had 26.9 against Jacksonville and 31.3 against Arizona. He was the wide receiver 5 and the wide receiver 2. And in that span, 25 targets, 21 catches, 252 through the air, and 2 touchdowns. So a really good catch rate. He's targeted heavily. If you're averaging over 10 targets a game, then that's a great workload. And if you're talented like Cooper Kupp, that helps a little bit as well. Then you have Justin Jefferson. He scored 35.6 against Detroit, 20.5 against Pittsburgh, averaging 21.5 points since the bye week. So he's just absolutely on fire. And since week 10, he's been the wide receiver 7, the wide receiver 1, the wide receiver 1, and the wide receiver 10. So in 4 weeks, all top 10 finishes, playing very well. He is another guy that's going to really push you through. Chris Godwin, he had 30.2 against Atlanta, 20.5 against Buffalo. Wide receiver 3 and wide receiver 11. And over those since week 11, he's had 32 targets, 25 receptions, 248 yards. Those were stats from the last 2 games. The stat from week 10 is that since week 11 was that he hasn't gotten a touchdown. So it's been a little bit since he scored a touchdown, but he's getting targeted so heavily and converting those targets into catches and yards that he's still scoring inside, top 5 category without scoring touchdowns. So imagine when he starts scoring touchdowns, it's going to be crazy. Jalen Waddle, he is going to close out the hot wide receivers. He's projected, he had 20.6 against the Jets, 28.7 against Carolina, and 18 points against the Giants. He's been targeted 30 times, has 27 catches for 292 and 2 touchdowns. I mean, only 3 misses on targets since, in 3 weeks. That's insane. That is incredible. And that's an average of 10 targets and 9 catches per game. So one mishap, 1 incompletion on 10 targets per game is an absolutely phenomenal stat. Now we move on to the hot tight ends. And again, obviously, George Kittle is going to be atop that list. He had 39.6 against Seattle, 34.1 last week against Cincinnati. Back-to-back tight end 1 weeks, and he's just fantastic. I mean, I'm pretty sure that he also was the number 1 player in fantasy 2 weeks ago. So, I mean, he's having a great season. 27 targets, 13 receptions, 151 yards, and a touchdown for him during this span. So in the last 2 games, he's got 27 targets. In the first game, 9 catches out of that for 181 yards and 2 touchdowns. And then the next game, 13 catches, 151 and a touchdown. If he continues this, he could just completely overtake the tight end position from everybody who's been playing all season. Absolutely crazy numbers. And, he's going to be a lot of fun if you have him for the remainder of the season. Rob Gronkowski, since his return from injury, he's averaging 16.35 fantasy points. And against Atlanta in Week 13, he had 4 catches, 58 yards, and 2 touchdowns for 21.8, which was good enough for the tight end 3 position. We don't have a whole lot to go off of with Rob Gronkowski, but since he's been back, a healthy average of 16.3, that's a great average. If your tight end is scoring you 16 points a week, you are very happy. So Rob Gronkowski's been pretty hot. And then you have Mark Andrews, who's averaged 16.1 since the Ravens bye. 4 of the 6 games, he's had 10 targets and 3 touchdowns, 1 100-yard game, and 1 double-digit reception game even. So he is just absolutely on fire, getting all kinds of opportunities that, I preach it. Opportunities equal chances for fantasy points. All right, so now that we are done with who's the hot commodities these past few weeks, now we enter the cool zone, the cool down zone. Who's cooling off? For your quarterbacks, you got Lamar Jackson. He's got 4 straight games under 20 points. He is questionable right now with an ankle, but that's besides the point. Over the past 4 games, he's got 3 touchdowns and 6 interceptions, 2 single-digit games out of that. So he's just not playing well. The Ravens as a whole aren't playing well. So there's a possibility, especially if he's hurt now, that you may need to pivot off of him because you don't want him to really, bite you at the end of the season. Then you have Jalen Hurts. He's only got 1 game over 20 since Week 7. He's again questionable as well with an ankle injury. He had only 11.2 against Detroit, 16.6 against the Chargers, 18.6 against the Broncos, and 6.86 against the Giants. He only had 1 game, as I said, over 20, and that was a 30-point performance against New Orleans in Week 11. So kind of a bright spot there. But again, if he's having an ankle issue, if the Eagles are struggling, all of those kinds of things, then you might want to pivot. Dak Prescott is going to be the last quarterback cooling off. He's got back-to-back games now under 15 points, 11.2 against New Orleans, and under 10 points against Washington, only 9.9. 2 touchdowns and 3 interceptions in that span, and they've scored a decent amount of points. So where's the numbers for Dak? They're just not there, and he's cooling off. He's got to still play Washington in a couple more weeks. And the fact that he only scored 10 there, it's not going to give you a lot of hope for your playoff semifinal. So you're going to need to pivot away from him for sure. At the running back position, you got Nick Chubb, who in his back-to-back weeks, both back-to-back against Baltimore, so you got to give him benefit of the doubt, but 5.9 in the first game, 5.9 in the first game, 9.5 in the second. In the 2 games before that, though, he had an absolute monster game. 30.3 against Cincinnati and then 22.4 against Detroit. So are we going to just write off these games as it was against Baltimore, they just had his number, yada yada, or are we going to look at it as, okay, we're going to need to proceed with caution because Chubb's on the cool down. Then you have Joe Mixon. He only had 9.4 against the Chargers and 8.8 against San Francisco. In those 2 games combined, he only had 112 rushing yards, a touchdown, 2 catches, and 10 yards through the air. But look back at his 4 games before those 2 really not good games. 25.1 against the Jets, 28 against Cleveland, 24 against the Raiders, and 32 against Pittsburgh. So I don't think it's time to hit the panic button on him. But, 2 straight weeks of not producing, it's kind of scary. And then this one pains me to say, but Cordero Patterson, he's only had 1 20-point game since in the last 8 games. But, he's been really close. 18 against the Jets, 14 against Miami, 18 against Carolina, 19 against New Orleans, 4.9 against Dallas. That's a tough one. 12.6 against Tampa Bay, and 13.9 against Carolina. So can he get back on track? I mean, he may get back on track because the Falcons are right now fighting for playoff spots. So there is a chance we see a little more out of Cordero Patterson. At the wide receiver position, we've got Tyree Kill. He's only got 4.2 against Denver and 11.6 against Vegas. 9 targets, 6 catches, 98 yards, and no touchdowns. But again, look back at his resume so far this season. 6 20-point games, 1 over 30, 1 over 40. So just, you got to stick it out. Sadly enough, I did not stick it out with him, and it kind of came and bit me in the rear end towards the end of the season in one league. Stephon Diggs, he only had 9.1 against New England, 14.4 against Tampa Bay, but the 5 games before that, he was averaging 19.6 on the season. So he's another one that, what does the rest of the season look like for him, and does the game plan change at all to get him more involved? Amari Cooper will finish out the wide receiver position. His last 2 games, he's only averaging 11.1 in the last 2 and 9.25 in the last 4. His highest game since week 8 was 16.1, which was last week, which is, you'd be like, oh, okay, well, now he's heating up. The fact that, you can't just take one game and say, okay, he's good. 9.25 points since the last 4 games. That is atrocious. And for a guy who's probably sitting in your number 1 wide receiver spot or your number 2 wide receiver spot, that is not worth it at all. For the tight end cooldown, you got Mike Gasiki. He's only had 2 games over 10 points since week 7. He's averaging 7.5 since week 7. And he hasn't had a touchdown since week 7. So week 7 was just the cutoff date for Mike Gasiki to fill out his paperwork for talent. And then he forgot to sign it. Now there's no talent there. He's really dropped off. But again, he's kind of like Cordero Patterson, that his team's now fighting to get back into the playoff spot. They've got a chance. There's a chance he could be more involved now because he's reliable and they're going to need to win these next few games. Dalton Schultz, this one kind of hurts me too. He's only got two games over 10 points since the bye. He's also only averaging 7.5 points per game. And he's got 1 game of 6.4 and 1 game of 1.4. So, it's not looking good for him. Proceed with caution with Dalton Schultz. And then this one's probably going to, stir up people just call me stupid, but Travis Kelsey. So hear me out. He's got back-to-back games with single digits in the exact same stat line for both games. 5.7 against Denver, 5.7 against Vegas. It gets even more identical of 3 catches, 27 yards, and 0 touchdowns. That's the individual stat line for each game the past 2 weeks. And if you look at kind of the rest of the season, they've got the Chargers, then they've got the Steelers, and then Cincinnati to finish out your fantasy season. So, again, it's Travis Kelsey. Don't panic, but do keep in mind that there's a chance that a 5.7 game could happen to you some point in these playoffs, and it could sink you. All right, so speaking of all of this playoff talk, who's got the best playoff schedule looking into this year's fantasy playoffs? At the quarterback position, Jalen Hurts has one of the better schedules. He's Washington, New York, the Giants, that is, and Washington again. Washington's 32nd against quarterbacks, giving up 24.31 fantasy points. And the Giants are 17th, giving up 20.08 fantasy points to the quarterback position. And in Hurts' last game against the Giants, that was not good. That was the 6.86 game. But again, he was dealing with an injury, still kind of is dealing with an injury. So he's got a great playoff schedule, but can he capitalize on it? That's the question. Then you got Matt Stafford. He's going up against Seattle, Minnesota, and Baltimore. Seattle is 11th against the fantasy quarterback position, only giving up about 18.2 fantasy points. And in that same game, just a few weeks ago, Matt Stafford scored 16.5. So, I mean, would you like to see that increase? Most definitely. But there's a chance it doesn't. But 16 points is still a good score. Then Minnesota, we have them at the 30th ranked defense against the quarterback. And they give up 31.85 fantasy points to the quarterback position. Baltimore, they give up 20.38 to the quarterback, and they are 31st against the quarterback position. Finishing off your quarterbacks, I like this one. Because we just talked about Mike Gasiki. We talked about the Dolphins really needing to get back in to that playoff hunt. Well, Tua is, the leader of the ship. He's going to have to be the one to really get all of that going. But how about this for your end of season, your fantasy playoffs, with a team that's playing well and on a win streak? You got the Jets, who are giving up 21 points per game, tied for 24th in the league. And then you have New Orleans, who is also tied for 24th in the league, giving up 20.31 fantasy points. And then he's got Tennessee, who's 26th against the pass, giving up 20.08 fantasy points to the quarterback position. Good Lord, people. I am tired. Tired. My eyes, I cannot keep them open. Let's get a swig. And then let's close this out. At the running back position, you got Javonte Williams, or I guess even Melvin Gordon. You could wrap into this as well. But they've got Cincinnati, Vegas, the Chargers for your fantasy playoffs. First week, they've got Cincy, 16.6, ranked 22nd. Then in your semifinal, they would have, or both of those running backs would have the Las Vegas Raiders, 22.15, and 30th against fantasy running backs. He only had 9.8 in their last game, but keep in mind that he didn't have the role that he has now. And what is that role? Well, let's look at their final opponent for your fantasy playoffs, the Los Angeles Chargers. They're 28th and give up 21 points per game. And Javonte, we just said, what is his role now? Well, it's 20.1 fantasy points. That's what his role has turned into. He's really turning into a workhorse, and it's fun to watch. Then you have Nick Chubb. We did talk about Chubb in that running back cooldown, kind of scared of it. But he's got Vegas, Green Bay, Pittsburgh, and Kareem Hunt as well. So again, like with Javonte and Melvin, you could be okay with either or in this situation as well. Las Vegas gives up 22.5 to the running back position. That is worst enough for 30th. Then you have Green Bay, going to be probably the toughest test, as they are 7th against the running back and give up 15.69. And then they close it out with Pittsburgh, who gives up 19.85 against the running back normally, and is 25th against running backs. And again, Nick Chubb played Pittsburgh once this season already. How did that fare? Well, he only got 7.9, so not great. You're hoping for a much better performance from him at that point. Then you have Clyde Edwards-Hilaire. Why am I talking about him? I don't like it. But he's got some good matchups coming up. He's got the Chargers, Steelers, and Bengals. Chargers give up 21 a game. They are 28th. And he had 16.9 against them last time. So a very good game. Probably looking to, catapult himself up somewhere with another game like that. And then you have Pittsburgh. They are 25th against running backs, giving up 19.85 fantasy points. And then Cincinnati, 16.6, 22nd against the run. For your wide receiver position, no surprise here, Cooper Kupp. But just imagine, he's probably the best receiver playing right now, and he's got one of the easier schedules to finish out your season. So he could absolutely wreck playoffs. He's going up against Seattle, who is 9th against the quarterback position, normally giving up 18.08. Excuse me. He had 16.2 against Seattle in their first game, so good showing there. Looking to build on that. And then he's got Minnesota, who is dead last against wide receivers, giving up 27.46 fantasy points, and Baltimore, sitting about middle of the pack, giving up 22.8. Then you have Keenan Allen. He's got Kansas City, Houston, Denver. Kansas City 7th against wide receivers, but that doesn't matter for Keenan Allen. He had 19 points in that last meeting. Houston is 19th against the wide receivers, and Denver is 10th against wide receivers. But again, not really going to be a factor because he scored 15.5 against the Broncos the first time they played. And then to wrap off the wide receiver position, a guy that really I've been saying for a while, I would choose him over all the rest of them because he's just so heavily targeted. But Deontay Johnson for the Steelers, going up against Tennessee, the Chiefs, and Cleveland. They've already played Cleveland, but they're going up against Tennessee, who's 31st against receivers, Kansas City, who is 7th, and Cleveland, who is 12th. But again, Deontay had a good game against Cleveland in their first run, 15.8 in that game. Now we have the tight end position to close out the show. Darren Waller. He's got Cleveland, Denver, and Indy. Cleveland's 25th against tight ends. Indy's 26th. Denver's 2nd, though. But the silver lining there is Waller had 10.9 the last time they played Denver, so there's no case sample size there. 10 points is better than under 10 points. And he's Darren Waller, and he's got a chance to go out and get way more than that anyway. Then you have Tyler Higby. He's been relatively quiet for most of the season, but he's got Seattle, Minnesota, and Baltimore all as his last 3 games. Seattle, they're 30th, and in their last game, Higby had 9.4. Minnesota, ranked 11th, and the Baltimore Ravens are 29th against the tight end position. And then we've got Pat Freiermuth. Not only is he one of the hotter players right now, but he's got a decent schedule. Tennessee, they're 5th against the tight end position, only giving up 4.38. So, your first round of your playoffs may not go how you want them to at tight end position if you have Freiermuth, but could be a lot better going up against Kansas City, who's 21st, and Cleveland, who is 25th, and already gave up 14.4 to Freiermuth there in their first meeting. So much going on. It's your fantasy playoffs. You got to make sure you're putting in the right people. If you have questions, you can go on to our Twitter and share them with us there. But also, send in your fantasy playoff team. I would like to see some people's teams. Send those in to @LuckyShotsMedia on Twitter. Just tweet me, and we'll see. And I'm kind of excited to see who you guys have in your lineups to get you to the playoffs, get you through the playoffs. Don't forget to join us tomorrow. We'll have Dylan Corbett on the show. We'll be talking bets and kind of hopefully get a recap of his adventures going to the Bengals game and going to the Minnesota game. So all that and more tomorrow, and we'll see you then.